Foundations are what support your house and transfer the weight of the building safely into the ground. They stop the building from sinking, shifting, or settling unevenly over time, but they also do a few other important jobs too. Foundations help protect the house from ground moisture, they help deal with changes in soil movement, and they help prevent problems caused by freezing, thawing, or unstable ground conditions. So while you never really see them once the house is finished, foundations are one of the most important parts of the entire build. The type of foundation you'll need will usually depend on things like the type of soil on your plot, whether there are trees nearby, the water table level, and the structural design of the house itself. Your structural engineer will normally make the final recommendation, but it is still useful for you to understand your options. So let's look at the 5 most common types that you could use for your self build. Standard strip foundations. This is the most common and often the most cost effective foundation type, and it works really well on many sites with stable soil conditions. The way it works is fairly simple. Trenches are dug underneath all of the external walls of the house and any internal load bearing walls. These trenches are usually around 450 to 600 millimeters wide and typically about 1 to 1.2 meters deep. Once the trenches are dug, a thick layer of concrete is poured into the bottom, which is normally at least about 225 millimeters thick. That concrete strip becomes the base that supports the walls of the house. After that, builders construct the foundation walls on top of this of concrete using blockwork. For a typical self-built house, around 10 metres by 7 metres, with one internal cross wall, you're usually looking at costs of roughly around £8,000 to £9,000. Ground workers can normally reach oversight level in about 10 working days. Because it's relatively straightforward and cost effective, this is often the default option when soil conditions allow it. Trench fill foundations. Trench fill foundations are very similar to strip foundations, but with one key difference. Instead of pouring a layer of concrete at the bottom and then building blockwork up from there, the trench is filled almost completely with concrete. So the concrete itself becomes much closer to ground level. This approach is often used when the soil sides of the trench aren't very stable, the water table is high, or the ground conditions make traditional blockwork below ground difficult. One big advantage of this is speed. Because you're filling most of the trench with concrete, you can often get out of the ground much faster. And because there's less block work below ground level, there's also less labour involved. The trade off is that you use more concrete, so the cost is usually slightly higher. For the same example house size, you're typically looking at around £9,500 to £10,000, but the project timeline may actually be shorter overall. Deep trench fill foundations. Sometimes the ground conditions force you to go much deeper with foundations. This is particularly common in areas with heavy clay soil and nearby trees. Trees absorb a lot of water from the soil, which causes clay to expand and shrink as moisture levels change. Over time, that movement can affect foundations if they're too shallow. So to avoid this, foundations sometimes need to be dug down to a depth where this movement doesn't affect them. This can mean digging as deep as 3 metres. At that depth, the trenches are then filled with large volumes of concrete to create very deep foundations. And because of the depth involved, extra safety measures are often needed, such as trench supports or shoring. In some cases, engineers may also add compressible materials or slip membranes to protect the foundations from soil movement. As you can imagine, digging this deep becomes more expensive. Costs can rise to around £16,000 or more, and constructions may take an extra week or so for the same size example house. Eventually, if digging deeper becomes too difficult or too expensive, it may make more sense to move to a different type of foundation entirely, which brings us on to our next option. Piled foundations with a ring beam. Piled foundations are used when the upper layers of soil aren't strong enough to support the building. Instead of relying on shallow foundations, piles are driven or drilled deep into the ground until they reach stronger load-bearing soil or rock. These piles act like deep structural supports for the house. Once the piles are installed, a reinforced concrete beam, often called a ring beam or ground beam, is constructed across the tops of the piles, and that beam then supports the walls of the house. Sometimes this beam is cast on site in concrete, and sometimes it's delivered as prefabricated concrete or steel sections. In some modern systems, the beam and the floor structure can even be combined into a single platform that the house sits on. Costs for piled foundations vary a lot depending on how deep the piles need to go and how many are required. For a typical 10 metres by 7 metres home, costs can range anywhere between £5,000 and £25,000. Installation time also varies. An in situ concrete beam system might take around 3 weeks, while a prefabricated system can sometimes be installed in as little as 10 working days if everything is well coordinated. There's also an alternative called helical screw piles, which are large steel screws driven into the ground. In some soil conditions, they can be a faster and cheaper alternative to traditional piling. Reinforced concrete raft foundations. Instead of supporting the building at individual trenches or piles, a raft foundation is essentially a large reinforced concrete slab that sits underneath the entire house. First, a large area is excavated. Then, layers of compacted hardcore are installed to create a stable base. On top of that, a reinforced concrete slab, the raft, is poured, and the whole house sits on top of that slab. This system spreads the weight of the house across a wider area, which helps when the ground has reasonable strength but may be unstable deeper below the surface, for example, in areas with historic mining activity or complex geological conditions. Raft foundations use a lot of concrete and need careful structural design, but in areas where they're common, ground workers often see them as a standard approach. Typically, they take around 10 to 15 working days to install, and costs usually sit somewhere in between £15,000 and £25,000 depending on the design, for the same example sized house. A question that often comes up is whether the foundation changes depending on the type of house you're building, for example, timber frame versus traditional masonry. In most cases, the foundations will be exactly the same, but in some situations, because timber frame buildings are lighter, engineers may be able to slightly reduce foundation requirements. This sometimes happens with piled foundations, where fewer piles may be needed. Another important detail is accuracy. Foundations need to match the building plans very closely, and if you're building with timber frame, the tolerances are particularly tight. Typical foundations should be level to within about 20mm and square to within about 12mm. That level of accuracy helps ensure the structure above fits properly once the construction begins. Overall, as you can see, there isn't just one type of foundation used for self-build homes. The right option depends on your ground conditions, the design of your house, nearby trees, soil stability, and a number of other factors. Your architect, structural engineer, and ground workers will usually work together to determine the best solution for your site. But having a basic understanding of these options can make it much easier to follow those conversations as your project develops. And if you're planning a self-build project and want to understand how the financing works alongside the construction process, that's something that we help with every day at Mayflower Mortgage. Book in for a free, no obligation call with our expert team today, and we'll happily talk through your plans and help you understand what your options might look like.